So we've gone through the real GDP growth aspect of the output gap. Remember, we want to analyze the deviations from trend of real economic growth. So we're not just looking at level of GDP, we're not just looking at growth of GDP, but we're looking at how far GDP is from its trend growth rate. In order to do that, so we've already got the growth rate of GDP, yay, but now we need that potential GDP growth rate as well. So that's going to help us define this Y tilde that we'll put on the horizontal axis of the ASAD curve. Real potential output is defined as the real potential gross domestic product or inflation-adjusted value of output if the economy were operating at full employment for all the factors of production. So that means all of our labor, all of our physical capital, all of our human capital, all of these things that we put into this production function down here, that potential real GDP, we combine all our labor and technology and natural resources and human capital and physical capital and institutions and the effect that they have, and we put it all together with this big output number, right? And that real potential output should be probably around this time, at least in, oh, that's 2031. So let me move back a bit more. I've got something weird with my recession dates here, so let's go ahead and delete that. So where that probably should be sometime around 2023 is about $20.4 trillion. That's where we should be if we are fully employing all of our labor and capital and resources, etc. If we change this into growth rates, what we then end up seeing is as the U.S. economy gets larger and larger, we're kind of slowing down our potential GDP output gap, which if you go to the development literature, you see this issue of convergence in real growth measures throughout all economies. So yes, you'll get lower and lower steady growth as your emerging economy becomes a more developed economy. So in the 80s and the 90s, we had this really kind of high 2.5 to 3% growth, and then we see in the wake of the Great Recession a lower output growth that we have. Again, this is the growth equation for that real potential GDP, looking more and more like 1.5 as we go through into the 2020s and estimated for into the 2030s. So we want to take this YP that we have here, our potential growth, and we want to subtract that from our real growth, from what we observe as if we say go back to what we defined as our real GDP growth here. Let me find that growth rate again. Well, there's our output gap. There we go. From our real growth then of our GDP, we want to look at that minus, take out that potential GDP and see how far above the potential trend we are. And that gives us our output gap. That is going to be the measure of output that we want for analyzing the expansions and contractions of the business cycle. So if we are above this zero measure, that'll be an expansion. If we're below this zero measure, that will be a contraction. Now again, we have now a zero level here because if we're supposed to be growing at 1.5% and we grow at 1.5%, the deviation is zero. But if we're supposed to be growing at 1.5% and we grow at 1%, the deviation is negative 0.5%, right? So that is going to help us better define the expansion and contraction cycle of the U.S. economy as it grows over time. And that's our basis for this ASAD model that we're going to use.